Although it's very easy to use the link data source control to connect controls to a database, you can also use the link code that you learned in Lesson 10.3 to do the same thing. Using C# code instead of the data source controls is helpful when you need more flexibility on your pages. For example, you can use if statements to return different sets of data depending on different conditions. You'll see how useful this can be in Lesson 12.8. To begin this lesson, open the Spark project from your Sample Files folder. And open reports.aspx in Design View, if it isn't open already. Now delete the link data source invoice control. You're going to connect the database to the grid view control manually using C# code, so you don't need the link data source anymore. Select the grid view control and remove the text from the data source ID property. When prompted to refresh the fields and keys, click No. Now open the code behind file of reports.aspx and add the following code to the page load event handler. Using Spark data context, data equals new Spark data context. var invoices equals data dot invoices dot order by invoice lambda invoice dot invoice date. This code retrieves the contents of the invoice table sorted by invoice date and places it into a collection called invoices. Now add the following code on the next line. Grid view invoice dot data source equals invoices. This code provides the grid view control with the data returned by your link code. Since the invoice objects all have names that correspond to the items in the table, the columns that were automatically generated by the link data source control earlier will continue to work without any problems. If you were to use data from a different table, you would have to set up your grid view controls columns to match the new table. Now add the following code on the next line. Grid view invoice dot data bind. Without this line, the data will not appear in the control. Whenever you change a control's data source property, you must call the data bind method before the new data will be displayed. Note that you can use the same technique to bind data to any control that has the data source property. The data that you bind to your controls doesn't have to be created by link. You can use any collection as a data source. Now let's see your code in action. View reports.aspx in your browser. The data is successfully displayed, but try clicking Edit, Delete, or one of the page numbers, and an error message appears. Without a link data source control to automatically handle these features, they will not work. The easiest way to allow editing, deleting, and paging is to use a link data source control. If you bind data to your control manually, you can still use the grid view control's automatic functions by adding row editing, row deleting, and page index changing event handlers. You'll learn more about this topic in the Expert Skills course in this series. Close your web browser now And you're going to fix the paging features by adding a page index changing event handler. Open reports.aspx in Design View and add a page index changing event handler to the grid view control. By creating your own event handler, you can enable the grid view control to use paging even without a link data source control. Add the following code in the new event handler: gridViewInvoice.pageIndex equals e.newPageIndex. gridViewInvoice.dataBind. This code will enable the paging features to work. Note that an object called e is often passed into an event handler as an argument. In this case, the newPageIndex property of the e object must be provided to the grid view control in order for it to move to the next page. Because the link code in this lesson is in the PageLoad event handler, the database will be queried every time the page posts back. On this page, that isn't an issue, but it's inefficient to requery the database if the data hasn't changed. You can make your queries more efficient by using an if statement along with the page.isPostBack property. You'll make use of this technique in Lesson 12.10. Close Visual Studio now, saving your changes if prompted. You've now completed Lesson 11.8. Bind data to a control using C# code.